Hello and welcome to another video in the How to Make a Chrome Extension video tutorial series. In the last video, I introduced promises and we also made notifications clickable. In this video, we're going to do a little bit more validation using dates. And we'll also talk about edge cases and how to solve them. We can clean up the conditional logic for setting the message in our create notification method. This string is identical to the first portion of the longer string, and it's always defaulted to this string. Let's simplify this by moving this template string to the original message creation up here, removing the else logic. In our number of slots check, we can remove the identical portion here and replace it with another template string of message. So our original message will contain the original found in open interview string. If the number of slots is greater than 1, then we concatenate the rest of the message to our original string. Another thing I want to do is move the onClicked event listener for the Chrome API outside of create notification. This is not creating a notification. This is listening to the API, so that is out of scope for this specific file. Let's move this to the background.js file. And back in the background.js file, underneath the onMessage listener, I'm just going to add it right there. Let's move the onAlarm listener towards the top as well, so that we've grouped all of our Chrome API listeners in one area. Now that we've got all of this cleaned up a little bit and organized, let's head back to the Chrome extension window. I want to show you a behavior that we haven't accounted for. Fill out all of the values inside of the Chrome extension window, hit save and start, open the service worker, and what we're going to do is clear the console and hit refresh. Working as expected, but if you open the Chrome extension window, you'll notice that the app still thinks that we're running. And it is actually still running. If you hold off for a little while here, like I did, you'll notice that an error pops up because there is nothing in our prefs. As we've refreshed the app, all of that data has now been cleared, but the alarm is still running in the background, and we need to handle this in our uninstalled lifecycle method. Hit stop and let's jump back to our code. We already have the uninstalled listener set up. This is where we are fetching our locations and caching them so that we can use it in the Chrome extension window to populate the options. We need a way to stop any alarm running in the background whenever a Chrome extension lifecycle event like an install or an upgrade happens. And we also have to set the running status that we use in the popup.js file at the bottom here. We need to set this to false so that we can populate the window properly. Fortunately for us, we kind of have something that already does that. Our handle on stop sets the running status to false, it stops the alarm, and it clears out the cache. So all we really need to do is just call handle on stop in our uninstalled listener. Let's give this a try. I've hit refresh, filled out the values. We'll hit save and start. Let's hit refresh again, and you'll notice it says on stop in background, and our is running status has been reset like we expected. We also don't see an alarm call anymore in our logs, which means that the alarm has also been cleared. Now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about dates. Our start date and end date doesn't really limit the user to valid date selections. For example, I can select any date in the past all the way back months. I can also set two dates equivalent to each other, and the user is currently able to set an end date that comes before the start date. So we need to have some way of handling the date validation on our Chrome extension window. Dealing with dates in JavaScript is kind of tricky and dirty, especially when we're talking about different time zones. I prefer to use a library called Spacetime because it's only about 40 kilobytes and has the essentials that we need for our pretty small application. We're going to use this in our application. Let's download it by copying this link, navigate to a new window, and go to that link. It will redirect you to the spacetime min.js file, which is what we're looking for. Let's save that to our local folder. And I'm going to drag that min.js file into the pop-up directory in our Chrome extension. Let's import it in our popup.html window. Make sure the spacetime import happens before the pop-up so that we can get access to it within the popup.js file. In our pop-up file, we got to think about where we want to handle the validation. We already have this perform onStart validations function that we're calling here, so we can probably plug into this and perform the date validations within that. Above perform onStart validations, create a new function and call it validate dates. When we're comparing dates in our app, we don't care about the hours or seconds or minutes. We're really just looking at the date itself. We don't want the date selected to be before today, and we don't want the end date to be before the start date. The start date can be equal to today, but the start date has to be before the end date. So let me write out what that logic is going to look like. So today has to be less than or equal to the start date, which has to be less than the end date. If you wanted to tweak this, you could make the start date equal to the end date. I prefer to have the end date and start date to be two different dates. But how do we know what exactly we're supposed to write here with our new Spacetime library? Fortunately, the Chrome extension DevTools has us covered. Let's hit refresh, open the Chrome extension window and right-click inspect, hop over to the console tab, and now let's write const today equal to spacetime.now with the invocation. We're not really too concerned with all of the different things in here. What we're really looking at is the epoch or epoch, depending on how you pronounce this. And you'll notice that it has additional data at the bottom here, additional numbers. What we need to do is remove the hours and minutes from this, and we can do that by using a handy function called startOf. The Spacetime library has a ton of great documentation on how to properly use it for our date comparison purposes. If you search for Spacetime JS documentation and you click the first GitHub link, you'll land on the Spacetime open source GitHub page. And if you scroll all the way down to date inputs, it'll show you tons of different examples on how to evaluate different dates. You'll see that start of day will return to us the day starting at the beginning of the day. So it won't return to us the minutes and seconds in its original format. It'll kind of remove that from whatever date that we're using. We want to perform this on all dates that we compare so that we're all on the same exact time. Back in our DevTools, if we do spacetime.now.startOf and then write day, Spacetime has removed those additional digits and zeroed them out. Spacetime also has a bunch of different functions that are going to be really useful for us. We're going to use isAfter, and you can even use isEqual, isBefore, isBetween, plenty of different ways to compare different dates against each other. In our Chrome extension DevTools, let's create two variables with the same date. I'm going to call it today and today2. Perform the calculation today.isEqual and then pass in today2. It returns true because they are equal. Let's check isAfter, and that's false because today and today2 are equivalent to each other. IsBefore operates the same way. Back in our code, let's create the same const for today. Remember to use startOfDay so that we can get rid of the time. Then let's create our start date, pass in the start date element.value. It'll parse that into a spacetime date for us, and we'll call startOfDay for that as well. Do the same thing for the end date. Now that we have all of our dates in the format that we want, we can validate the start and end dates. Above validate dates, write a new function called validate start date. Inside of here, we can do all of our validation for the start date, including verifying if the values exist. I'm going to cut this from perform onStart validations, just the start date element part, and let's paste it in the validate start date function. Now let's confirm that the start date is after today. We can do that by writing start date is before today, and we'll evaluate that to a date. We need to show a custom error if the dates are invalid, like this, if it's before today. We can do that by using the same kind of logic that we did for showing and hiding the error scenarios. In our case, we just have to show the error and change the inner text. We can do that by writing a new function called showDateError that takes in the date element and an error message. Then we can set the date element inner HTML to the message, and we can show the element. And I'm going to rename this to date error element. It might have been confusing because the date element could have meant the start date element itself, but we're actually looking at the little end date error paragraph inline error message that we show. So we'll be passing this into the show date error functions. Instead of just showing the start date error message, let's instead show a date error. We'll pass in the start date error element, and we'll pass in our own error message. So if no value exists for the start date element, then we just show please enter a valid start date. Otherwise, if the start date is before today, then we want to show that specific error. We'll do the same thing as above by passing the start date error and our own error message. Finally, let's return start date element dot value and is after today. So if the start date element value has some kind of value, then this will evaluate to true. And if the start date is after today or equal to it, then this will also return true, meaning that the validate start true will evaluate to true. Let's call validate start date in our validate dates method, pass in today and start date. Now let's do the same thing we did for validate start date. We'll do that for validate end date. Pass in today, start date, and end date. For the end date, we have to verify that it's after the start date and it's also after today. Write a new Boolean called is after start date, and we'll just compare end date is after the start date and evaluate that on the date. We'll also do the same thing with today. Let's also confirm that the end date has some kind of value in it like we did with the start date. I'm going to cut the end date element checks within here and paste it in validate end date. We will show our own error by passing in the end date error, and please enter a valid end date. So if the end date is empty or null or something, then we'll just say please enter a valid end date. If the end date is not after the start date, we want to tell the user that the end date must be after the start date. And if the end date is not after today, we'll also show a new error of end date must be after today. If all of these succeed, then we can just hide the error element. Let's call validate end date within our validate dates method is end date valid, pass in today, start date, and the end date. And finally, we can just return is start date valid and is end date valid. Back in our perform on start validations, let's call our validate dates method by writing is date valid, and we will invoke the validate dates method. Let's remove this, and I just realized that we forgot to return end date element dot value to confirm that there is something that exists in that element, that the end date is after the start date and that it's after today. Now we can actually use this by returning the location ID element value, making sure that that's also not invalid, and we'll return is date valid as well. Perform on start validations is already called when we hit the start button on click, so we can move on to our test. Let's compare two equal dates. I'm going to change the end date to 1/30/2023. If we hit save and start, it'll say the start date must not be before today and end date must be after the start date. I just realized that it's actually 1/31, so this is actually working as expected. So let me move this to February 5th, hit save and start. That error message goes away. This one is still here because it's before the start date. Let's switch that to February 5th, and it tells us end date must be after the start date. If we put it to February 6th and hit save and start, it starts working. So our date validations are working and they look really good, but I think I would also like to disable previous dates that are before today in the calendar widget. We can do that by using the Spacetime library again. If we go all the way to the bottom here in our pop-up file, let's save a reference to spacetime.now, and we'll run a format on that spacetime.now. The dot format function that we're using to set the min attribute on our HTML tags prints out the date in a readable format. So that's what we use to pre-populate that date input. We can set the minimum attribute on the date element to today. And we can do that by doing dot set attribute, passing in the attribute name, which is min, and passing in today as the second argument. So that's just setting the min attribute to today. Let's do the same for the end date element. Now, if you open up the calendar widget, you'll see that previous dates are not selectable anymore for either the start date or the end date. If you right click inspect on one of the dates, you'll notice that there is a min of the value for today like we set with our attribute. We set the min in the code, and Chrome's calendar widget understands the min attribute and will gray out and not allow the user to select previous dates than what the min is selected. And that is it for today. We learned a ton in this video. We learned how to handle a specific edge case in the Chrome extension lifecycle. We did a little bit of cleanup, and we finally figured out how to handle our date validations so the user doesn't enter incorrect dates. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe so I know to keep making more of these. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Jerry.